Welcome, dearly beloved anointed ones. The scariest part about being right is watching everyone who laughed at you realize it. Chosen ones, we need to talk. Because right now your silence is screaming, and the whole community is shook like they just found out their favorite pastor was on a dating app. Here's a fact. In psychology, it's called cognitive dissonance, when people are mentally paralyzed by a truth that contradicts the lie they've built their entire reality on. And guess what? That's exactly what's happening now. Everything you tried to warn them about, the betrayal, the abuse, the secret deals, the spiritual warfare, is surfacing like a dead body in shallow water. They said you were dramatic. They said you were doing too much. Some even called you demonic for speaking the truth. But now, the very same people who laughed at your discernment are having breakdowns in private, pretending to be fine in public, while secretly Googling how to reverse karma in 30 days or less. Because here's the kicker. You didn't just predict an event, you exposed an entire ecosystem of dysfunction. And now the chickens aren't just coming home to roost. They're throwing bricks through the windows they used to gossip behind. So sit back, chosen one, because this is vindication season. Let's talk about what they're too scared to admit. You were right, and they're terrified of what else you saw. Number one, you weren't paranoid, you were perceiving. You weren't paranoid, you were perceiving. That's the part they never understood. You weren't running around scared of your own shadow, you were picking up signals no one else could detect. You saw things they refused to look at. Your gut told you something was off, and instead of ignoring it like everyone else, you paid attention. That's not paranoia. That's spiritual intelligence. You didn't need evidence at the time because your spirit had already filed the report. They rolled their eyes, called you negative, said you were always overthinking or too deep. But now those same people are pacing the floors at night, realizing everything you sensed is actually happening. The same ones who swore you were being dramatic are now seeing the drama unfold in real time. And they don't know whether to apologize or pretend they still don't see it. What they missed is that some people feel the shift before it breaks the surface. You felt the betrayal before it came out. You sensed the lies before the confession. You knew the mask before it slipped. And because you reacted to something invisible, they said you were crazy. But now the invisible is visible. The quiet tension you noticed, it's exploding. The strange energy in the room you pointed out, everyone feels it now, but too late. You weren't being extra. You were being early. You caught the scent of the storm before the clouds formed. That's not delusion. That's discernment. And while they were laughing, you were preparing. You were building your peace while they were partying in denial. You were steadying your soul while they were gambling with their futures. Now that it's all falling apart, they're finally seeing what you saw. But now they have to live through the chaos they once mocked you for noticing. And you don't need revenge, you already have it. It's called being proven right in a world that swore you were wrong. Number two, the truth is allergic to crowds, but contagious in silence. The truth is allergic to crowds, but contagious in silence. When you first started speaking up, people acted like your words were poison. They rolled their eyes, gave you side looks, and some even tried to shame you into staying quiet. Not because you were wrong, but because the truth you carried was too sharp for their comfort. You weren't the problem, your accuracy was. It exposed what they were trying hard not to face. Truth isn't popular. It doesn't draw applause in rooms where lies built the furniture. That's why when you warned them, whether it was about a person, a pattern, or a hidden agenda, they turned on you. They needed you to be wrong because if you were right, everything they believed in would start to crumble. So instead of looking at the truth, they labeled you bitter, dramatic, or doing too much. That label was easier than facing their own denial. But now, the silence is getting loud. The very things you spoke of are starting to unfold in ways they can't ignore. People who once dismissed your words are starting to replay your conversations in their heads. They're beginning to connect dots they didn't want to see before. And the wild part? You haven't said a word lately. You don't need to. The truth has a way of echoing louder after everyone's done talking. What's really shaking them now isn't just that you were right, It's that you're no longer trying to prove it. You're not campaigning for validation or explaining yourself anymore. And that silence, that's what's haunting them, because when someone stops talking, it forces others to start thinking. Your quiet confidence is making more noise than any argument ever could. They're starting to whisper what they once shouted against, because deep down they remember everything you said. And now that it's all happening, they're realizing the truth didn't need a crowd, it just needed time. Number 3, your exile was a community strategy, not a coincidence. Your exile wasn't random, it was planned. They didn't just accidentally leave you out, overlook you, or forget to invite you. They removed you on purpose. The moment you started speaking truth, they weren't ready to hear. You became a threat. You were no longer safe to the system they built around silence, secrets, and surface-level peace. And because they couldn't control your voice, they tried to cancel your presence. The community didn't isolate you because they were confused. They did it because they were fully aware of what your presence disrupted. You weren't just another person with an opinion. You were carrying a level of insight that exposed the very dysfunction they were pretending didn't exist. You saw through the fake unity, the forced smiles, and the unspoken rules. You knew when things didn't add up. And worse, you weren't afraid to say it. That made you dangerous. They couldn't discredit what you were saying, so they worked to discredit you. They started with whispers. Then came the side eyes, the passive aggression, the subtle smear campaigns. Eventually, you were pushed to the outskirts, treated like an outcast, and painted as the problem. Not because you were wrong, but because they needed your voice out of the way before it woke up the whole room. Now, the irony is, the very thing they tried to silence is showing up in real time. The warnings you gave are unfolding. The people you spoke about are being exposed. The situations you sensed are finally blowing up. And the ones who helped exile you, they're stunned because they never thought truth had such a memory. You weren't cast out because you didn't belong. You were cast out because you belonged too much. Your clarity outgrew their comfort. And now that the fallout is happening, they're realizing the one they tried to shut out was the only one telling the truth the whole time. Number 4, you were a premature answer to a prayer they didn't know they needed yet. You were the answer long before they even knew what they were asking for. They prayed for signs, for truth, for protection from betrayal, for the mask to come off their enemies. They begged God for discernment, for help, for a way out of cycles they couldn't break. And God sent you, raw, real, human, no halo, no theatrical entrance, just a soul carrying the exact insight, energy, and authority they needed. But because you didn't look like the answer they pictured, they dismissed you as the problem. They were expecting someone soft-spoken, agreeable, easy to digest. You showed up sharp, unfiltered, and unapologetically clear. That scared them. You didn't come to entertain their delusions or play along with dysfunction. You came with eyes that saw too much, a voice that cut too deep, and a spirit that refused to shrink to make them comfortable. So instead of receiving you, they rejected you, not knowing they were pushing away the very help they cried out for. They couldn't recognize you because they were still idolizing false images of what help should look like. They thought protection would feel gentle, not like exposure. They thought guidance would sound soft, not like confrontation. But truth doesn't always come in robes. Sometimes it walks in wearing your reflection, holding up a mirror and asking questions you've spent your whole life avoiding. Now the things you tried to warn them about are happening. The people you tried to call out have finally shown their true faces. The cycles you tried to interrupt are exploding in front of them, and suddenly they're realizing God really did answer their prayer. He just didn't answer it in the packaging they expected. And now they have to live with the fact that they sent their deliverance away because it didn't fit their comfort zone. They thought they were protecting themselves from harm. What they really did was block their own healing. Number 5, you were the real emergency alarm, not the chaos. You were the real alarm, the walking warning. Long before anything went wrong, your presence alone started unsettling the atmosphere. You didn't come with sirens and flashing lights, but everything about you screamed, something's not right here. Your energy, your questions, your silence, your refusal to play along, all of it was disruptive in the best way. Not because you were trying to cause problems, but but because you were calling attention to problems they desperately wanted to ignore. They mistook your insight for interference. Your ability to sense danger before it became visible made them uncomfortable. You weren't the one starting chaos, you were the one trying to stop it. But they couldn't handle the discomfort of early truth. They wanted to stay asleep, to keep pretending, to enjoy the illusion. So they hit snooze over and over again. They told themselves you were too sensitive, too spiritual, or always looking for something wrong. They weren't ready to admit that your discomfort was a sign, that your resistance wasn't rebellion, it was revelation. You were alert while they were numb. You were awake while they were sedated by denial. They thought chaos would come with explosions, but it came quietly. First through your presence, your intuition, your warnings. Now that the real fallout is here, relationships collapsing, secrets exposed, consequences dropping like bricks, they're finally looking around asking, why didn't someone say something? But someone did, you did. You were the siren. You were the signal. You were the divine interruption sent to shake them out of the comfort zone they didn't realize was killing them. But their ego couldn't handle the truth coming from you, because accepting your warning would have meant admitting that someone they overlooked, rejected, or underestimated was actually the only one tuned in. So they ignored the alarm. And now the fire they tried to pretend wasn't coming, it's at their front door. And all they can do now is remember the one voice they silenced. Number 6, the community wasn't confused. They were complicit. They weren't clueless. They were comfortable. The community saw the signs just like you did. They heard the whispers, felt the shifts, noticed the strange behavior. But instead of confronting the truth, they looked the other way. Not because they didn't understand what was happening, but because facing it would have required them to take a side. And choosing truth over tribe is a lonely road, so they stayed quiet, hoping silence would shield them. It didn't. When you stood up and called out what nobody else wanted to talk about, you didn't just expose the issue. You exposed everyone's loyalty to the lie. That's what really made them uncomfortable. You were a mirror. Your courage forced them to face their cowardice. Your refusal to stay silent made their silence look like agreement, because it was. They weren't confused, they were complicit. They saw the same darkness you did, but chose community over conviction. They watched as you got labeled, isolated, and cast out, and most of them said nothing. Not because they thought you were wrong, but because they didn't want to suffer the same fate. They let you carry the weight of truth alone, while they blended in with the very system that was breaking people in silence. They smiled at you in passing, but spiritually, they left you for dead. Now the storm you warned them about is here. The lies are unraveling. The leaders they defended are being exposed. The peace they protected has turned into panic. And the ones who clung to the herd are realizing the herd was heading straight into disaster. You were never the threat. You were the siren. But they chose denial over disruption, and now the fallout is exposing just how deep their fear of standing alone really was. They thought staying quiet would save them, but now they're drowning. Not because they didn't know, but because they chose not to act, and the one they cast out, you're standing dry on the shore, holding the truth they were too afraid to carry. Number 7, you shattered the illusion, and that made you dangerous. You didn't just speak truth. You exposed the foundation. The entire community was functioning like a stage play where everyone knew their role. Pretend, smile, nod, and never speak too deeply. Everything was held together by unspoken agreements, toxic loyalty, fake peace, and the understanding that nobody would rock the boat, no matter how much water it was already taking in. Then you showed up and flipped the script. You started asking the questions no one wanted to hear. You challenged the behaviors everyone had normalized. You refused to stay quiet about what was clearly wrong. That alone made you a threat. Not because you were doing harm, but because your clarity disrupted their comfort. Your honesty didn't just tell the truth. It exposed the lie they were all silently agreeing to live in. They didn't hate you. They hated what your presence revealed about them. Your authenticity forced people to confront their own hypocrisy. Your voice made their silence look complicit. Your integrity showed just how much they were willing to tolerate just to keep their spot in the circle. You didn't break the community. You revealed that it was already broken and everyone was too scared to admit it. That's why they tried to push you out. That's why they whispered behind your back, labeled you difficult or divisive. They couldn't afford for others to start thinking like you, questioning like you, waking up like you. You were contagious, not in a viral way, but in a spiritual way. You were waking people up, and that scared them more than anything. Now the illusion they were clinging to has finally collapsed. The secrets are leaking, the tension they buried is erupting, and they're standing in the rubble, realizing the thing they tried to silence was the only thing that could have saved them. You weren't the destroyer, you were the revealer. They built the house on sand, and you just had the nerve to say it out loud. Number 8. What they called disrespect was really discernment. They called it disrespect because that was easier than admitting you saw the truth. They needed a label for your resistance, so they called it rebellion. They said you had an attitude, that you didn't know your place, that you were being dramatic or divisive. But what really scared them was your discernment. You saw what they spent years pretending not to see. You weren't rebellious, you were awake. You weren't disrespectful for questioning the behavior of the ones they worshipped. You weren't out of line for noticing that the pillar of the community was emotionally abusive, or that the beloved leader was manipulative and power-hungry. You saw the rot in the roots of what they were told to blindly protect. But instead of joining in the applause, you asked questions, you spoke up, you pulled back. That's when they turned on you. Not because you were wrong, but because you made it harder for them to keep lying to themselves. You challenged the sacred cows they built their identity around. You didn't just see the patterns of abuse, you refused to participate in them. You refused to laugh at what wasn't funny. You stopped sitting quietly in rooms where truth was being suffocated. You didn't play the politics. You didn't kiss the ring. You didn't sell your soul for acceptance. That was never rebellion. That was your spirit rejecting the counterfeit. They weren't ready to confront the truth because confronting it meant they'd have to admit they were victims too, or worse, enablers. Your clarity shamed their complicity. Your voice highlighted their silence, so they chose the easier narrative that you were the problem. But now the masks are cracking, the idols are falling, and they're starting to realize that the one they labeled disrespectful just had the nerve to see clearly. Your discernment wasn't disrespect, it was divine protection. And now the very people who judged your resistance are wishing they had your vision. Number 9, your suffering became the litmus test for judgment. Your suffering wasn't random, it was deliberate. While others enjoyed the illusion of peace, you were put through the fire. They watched as you endured the betrayal, the isolation, the unfairness, all while they stayed silent or even added to the weight you carried. They mistook your pain for weakness, for a sign that you were overreacting or too sensitive. What they didn't realize was that your suffering wasn't just happening to you. It was a litmus test, a measuring stick for their hearts. The way they treated you was more revealing than they ever understood. They had no idea that the way they dismissed you, ignored you, or even actively turned against you would be the very thing that exposed the truth of their character. They thought their actions were insignificant. A few harsh words here, a moment of cold indifference there. But in the grand scheme of things, those small gestures were catalogued. Every slight, every judgment, every time they chose convenience over truth, it was all being documented. Heaven and earth were watching, and their treatment of you became the benchmark by which they'd be measured. Now that the very things you warned them about are unfolding, they're starting to understand. The betrayal they witnessed, the systems they defended, the people they enabled, it's all coming to light. And in the midst of that chaos, they're realizing that the way they treated you is the key piece of evidence. When the dust settles, when the truth is fully exposed, the way they responded to your pain will be the final witness against them. It will be the evidence heaven uses to reveal the condition of their hearts, their priorities, and their true character. Your suffering wasn't wasted. It wasn't just a phase you had to endure. It was preparation. It was proof. Your pain became the document they can't escape, the reflection of their own choices. And now, as everything unravels, they'll see it. The way they mistreated you was the very thing that sealed their fate. You didn't just survive, you became the evidence of their hypocrisy. Number 10. You didn't just predict events, you exposed cycles. You didn't just make a prediction, You unveiled the deeper currents running beneath everything. It wasn't about one isolated event or a single piece of drama. It was about the entire ecosystem of their choices. The patterns, the cycles, the things they couldn't see because they were too busy reacting to the surface-level chaos. You saw the spiritual blueprint that governed their lives. And when you spoke out, you didn't just warn them about the next crisis. You were exposing the unseen system that made that crisis inevitable. You weren't just talking about the latest betrayal or the newest scandal. You were pointing to the generational dysfunction that had been passed down like a curse, the karmic debt that was accumulating quietly behind the scenes, and the psychological warfare being waged within their relationships. They thought these things were random, isolated, or just part of life's ups and downs, but you knew better. You knew these patterns were set in motion long before they even realized it. You saw the cycles repeating, the wounds unhealed, the same mistakes being made over and over, and you had the courage to call it out. Now, as the fallout unfolds, they're watching everything play out like a rerun of your prophecy. The very things you warned them about are happening one after another. The generational patterns they thought they could outrun are catching up with them. The consequences of their choices are no longer abstract. They're in their faces, manifesting in ways they can't deny. And it's not just an event, it's a whole cycle coming full circle, just as you said it would. They're seeing the patterns repeat in real time. And now they're starting to realize that you weren't predicting the future. You were simply reading the script that was already written by their past actions. They just didn't want to see it. They couldn't bear the thought that the chaos around them wasn't just happening by chance. It was the result of choices made long ago, and now they're stuck watching it all unfold. What they thought was an isolated problem was really the climax of a story you had already read, and now they're living in the sequel they never wanted. Number 11. You were spiritually assigned, not socially accepted. You were never meant to blend in with the crowd, never meant to be a part of the social fabric they wove. Your presence in their lives wasn't a coincidence. It was a spiritual assignment. You were placed in that space not to conform, but to observe, to reflect the truth, even when it wasn't comfortable, even when it wasn't popular. Your role wasn't to fit in. It was to hold up a mirror to what everyone else was too afraid to face. They mistook your detachment for arrogance, for being too standoffish, too proud, or too self-righteous. But the reality is you weren't distant because you thought you were better than them. You were distant because you saw what they couldn't. You understood the bigger picture. You recognized the patterns, the weaknesses, and the spiritual dynamics at play that they couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. You weren't there to play their social games. You were there as a divine observer, tasked with seeing things clearly, even when it meant standing alone. Your detachment wasn't rejection, it was divine discernment. You saw the cracks beneath the surface that they chose to ignore. You noticed the corruption, the manipulation, the subtle betrayals. But because you weren't emotionally entangled in the drama, because you didn't jump into the same toxic cycles they indulged in, they misread you. They assumed you didn't care. They assumed you were too good to get involved. But what they didn't realize was that your distance wasn't about superiority. It was about divine assignment. And now, as everything unfolds, they see it. They see that your detachment wasn't about arrogance or disdain. It was about spiritual clarity. The truth you saw coming has now arrived. The chaos they ignored is now their reality. The manipulation they didn't want to face is now inescapable. And now, as the pieces fall into place, they're witnessing your vindication. What they rejected, what they didn't understand, is now being revealed for what it truly was: divine insight in human form. The one they pushed aside is now being lifted up, publicly acknowledged and vindicated by the very forces they once ignored. Your role was never to blend in. It was to stand apart, to reflect truth, and to reveal the patterns others were too afraid to confront. And now the sender, the divine force that assigned you, is showing the world just why you were always meant to be set apart. Number 12. Your silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Your silence wasn't born from fear or weakness, it was a calculated divine strategy. You understood something they didn't, that the most powerful statement you could make was to stop engaging in their noise. While they sought validation through conflict, argument, and constant defense of their positions, you chose a different path. You understood that time, with all its unfolding wisdom, would eventually reveal the truth far more powerfully than your words ever could. So instead of fighting battles you knew were futile, you stepped back. You let them laugh, let them mock, let them exile you. Because you knew that in time the tables would turn. They thought your silence was defeat, a sign that you had nothing left to say. They thought it was weakness, that you were just tired of the fight or too intimidated to face them. But in reality, you were biding your time. You were waiting for the inevitable moment when the truth would come to light, not because you shouted it from the rooftops, but because life itself would expose it. And now, as time has passed, you're witnessing the consequences of their arrogance and ignorance, the positions they took, the assumptions they made, the judgments they passed. It's all unraveling, and in the midst of their unraveling, they are seeing something they never expected. Your silence is speaking louder than their applause ever did. While they were busy celebrating their temporary victories, you were quietly observing, understanding that the final word was never meant to come from you. It was meant to come from reality itself. Now, as they face the fallout from their choices, they're realizing that their noise was just distraction and your quiet was power. Your silence wasn't surrender, it was preparation. And now that everything you warned them about is happening, your silence is the only thing left standing, echoing louder than all the applause they gave themselves. Number 13. They thought they were avoiding conflict. They were delaying consequence. They thought they were avoiding conflict, but in reality, they were just postponing the inevitable consequences of their choices. When you showed up, you weren't just another voice in the crowd. You were a warning shot, a signal that something was deeply wrong. You didn't just speak out. You embodied the truth that they were too afraid to confront. But instead of listening, instead of acknowledging the warning, they dismissed you, thinking they could sidestep the discomfort you represented. They told themselves they were staying neutral, that they didn't need to take a side, that avoiding confrontation was somehow the wise thing to do. What they didn't realize was that in their attempt to avoid conflict, they were only setting themselves up for destruction. Your presence wasn't an inconvenience. It was an invitation to change, a call to face the reality they had been too comfortable to confront. But their dismissal wasn't some passive oversight. It was an active decision, a choice to ignore the truth and allow the seeds of destruction to take root. By choosing to stay neutral in the face of clarity, they sealed their fate. Their neutrality wasn't a position of wisdom. It was an agreement with the lies that were quietly taking over. Now, as the consequences unfold, they're waking up to the truth they tried to dodge. The storm they thought they could outrun has arrived, and the very thing they avoided has now become their reality. They thought staying silent or refusing to engage would spare them the fallout, but it didn't. In fact, it was the very thing that allowed the lies to spread unchecked. And now, as everything they ignored crumbles around them, they're realizing that neutrality in the face of truth is not safety. It's complicity with the destruction they never saw coming. They didn't just fail to act, they chose to partner with the very forces that were destined to undo them. Number 14, you were the storm they should have prepared for, not run from. They saw you as the storm, the disturbance, the challenge that threatened their comfortable little world. They were wrong. You weren't the storm. You were the warning, the protection they should have been preparing for, not running from. They mistook your presence for disruption, when in reality it was divine intervention in human form. You weren't sent to destroy them, you were sent to wake them up, to shake them out of their complacency before the true storm arrived. But instead of rising to the challenge, they retreated. They chose comfort over confrontation, seeking peace through silence, avoiding the hard truths you came to reveal. They thought the disturbance you brought was the danger, when in reality, the danger was their refusal to listen. Now, as chaos descends on them, the revelation has arrived. The storm they were too scared to face is here, but so is the understanding. You weren't the problem. You were the protection they didn't recognize in the moment. They thought avoiding you, dismissing you, or even attacking you would shield them from what was coming. But divine justice has a perfect memory, and it doesn't forget. the moment when they chose convenience over truth. It doesn't forget how they chose to keep their illusions intact instead of facing the hard reality you were offering them. And now, as they stand in the aftermath, they're realizing what they could have avoided if they'd just listened. The chaos they're enduring could have been prevented, or at the very least softened, if they'd treated you like the protection you were. But by rejecting the storm that came with you, they invited a much greater one. The irony is not lost on them. The very thing they ran from was the very thing that could have saved them. The storm wasn't you, it was their refusal to face the truth. You weren't their enemy, you were their salvation in disguise. And now, as the dust settles, they're left facing the consequences of ignoring the very protection that was sent to them. In the end, the story you've lived, the struggles you've faced, and the truths you've carried have all led to this moment, where everything you warned them about is unfolding and they are beginning to see what they could never understand before. You were never meant to blend in or conform. You were a catalyst, a force of nature sent to challenge, disrupt, and ultimately save those who would listen. You didn't just survive the storm, you were the storm. And now that the chaos they feared has arrived, they are beginning to see that you were the protector they mistook for the threat. Everything they ran from, rejected, or misunderstood about you is now clear. They see the divine orchestration, the cosmic timing, the reason you were placed in their lives, not to break them, but to build them up. They see the truth now, and though they may never admit it, your silence, your detachment, and your unwavering faith were never about them. They were about you being true to your purpose. You didn't need their approval or validation because your assignment was greater than their opinions. Divine justice is always a perfect measure, and now it's evident that everything you endured, every insult, every moment of being misunderstood, wasn't in vain. You weren't just witnessing their downfall, you were witnessing your elevation. The very things they thought would break you are the things that have elevated you into the role you were destined for. Now, as the dust settles and the pieces fall into place, they'll see it. You weren't a mere bystander. You were the truth, the warning, the force that could have saved them. And though they may not fully grasp the depth of your role, they'll remember it. Your name will be spoken in quiet reverence, because in the end they'll understand. You were never their problem. You were the answer they refused to see. And as the divine order restores what was lost, you will stand tall, unshaken, because you knew all along that this moment was coming. You were always the storm they should have prepared for. If you felt the power of these words, if something inside you clicked and you're ready to see the truth unfold in your own life, make sure you don't miss out on what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button, because we're just getting started. Join this community of truth seekers and believers who aren't afraid to stand apart and embrace the journey. Like this video if it resonated with you. Leave a comment below. I want to hear your story, your perspective, and what you're waking up to. And don't forget to share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because we're all in this together. Let's keep waking up, standing strong, and embracing the divine purpose that's unfolding. Keep shining, keep growing, keep rising.